2023 program, which is heat rate, flexibility, fleet generation optimization at EPRI. And I'm joined by Mike Caravaggio, who's the director of the thermal fleet for power generation. And we're going to walk you through the transition, the energy transition in India over the next 30 minutes or so. And then I'm going to turn it over to Mike after that, kind of provide some global perspectives on what's going on here. So the clicker stopped working. Yep, there we go. So first of all, I just want to kind of walk you through India's story, which is quite fascinating. So if we look at generation growth for India, you can kind of see 1969, 1970, not a lot of power generation in India. And over the last 20, 30 years, we've seen phenomenal growth of power generation in India. And there's also been massive economic growth that parallels with that generation growth over the last 20, 25 years. Most of that growth has really been focused on providing access to electricity in India. So here you can see kind of a percent of the population versus where we are over the last 22 years, kind of see what that growth in getting access to electricity in India looks like. And then we can kind of look and see the red line that's dashed in the middle. That's kind of where we are. India's got just under 1.5 billion people in the population of that country, very, very close proximity to China, probably likely to exceed China's population in the very near future. And then over time, we're going to see that population is expected to decline some or flatline over the next couple of years. But there's been a lot of growth in the population, a lot of growth in the power generation source. So over the last 20 years, you can kind of see on the bar graph to the left, kind of what that extraordinary success looks like in providing hundreds of power to hundreds of millions of people in the population of India. So you can kind of see that consistent 7 to 8% growth rate over the last 2 years. But what's unique about India is even though they're the third largest global emitter of CO2, it's a very low per capita CO2 emissions profile. So if you compare that low per capita energy consumption to China or the United States, you kind of see the blue bar represents the CO2 emissions per country. India is very low, so 1,255 per capita is very low as compared to China, which almost has the equivalent population. So that's something important to think about when we're looking at global CO2 emissions, what the world emissions outlook looks like from a decarbonization strategy from a global perspective. And Mike will shine some light on that in a little bit. But you can kind of see where India is today, kind of where China is today, and then try to figure out where India is going to be in the next 15, 20 years. It's going to be an interesting story yet to come. So just kind of put that in perspective, where does most of the power generation come from in India? And it's no surprise, most of that power generation comes from thermal coal plants in India. So you can see the black bar represents what I'm showing here is January 2022 to January 2023. And you can see power generation from those coal-based thermal assets is somewhere between 107 to 120 billion units of total power generation as compared to nuclear, which is the orange bar, as compared to hydro, which is the blue bar, which is very low. And so these thermal plants, just for those of you who are joining that have never seen a thermal plant in India, this is a very typical look inside the control room, very typical thermal plant to the left-hand side. This was a trip that I was on last year in India at one of NTPC's plants. And then on the far right, you can see the intake canal for that thermal plant where they've got 100 megawatts of floating solar behind me, which is not only helping improve the efficiency of that solar, but also trying to keep the intake water down, which helps heat rate. So India is doing a lot of innovative things with new supercritical technologies for the thermal plants, but they're also doing a lot of innovative things with solar and wind capacity in the generation. Now, if we compare that thermal-based generation to the renewable-based generation, where we are in 2022 to 2023 in that same time frame I showed with the Indian scenarios, we're somewhere between 10 to 12% total renewable capacity. So you can see here, this is all the renewable in the form of wind and solar. We always see an uptick in wind generation right at the onset of the rainy season in India. So between May and June is typically when we see the peaks in renewable energy generation, but you can kind of see that. So that represents about 10%. Now, what's fascinating about the energy transition in India is to kind of see where they're going in the next 10 years. So I'm going to kind of share with you a little bit more about what's going on with the Indian scenario. So a lot of, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of progress towards universal access to electricity. So if we look back 5 years back, even though there's been a lot of growth in renewable generation, India had 35 gigawatts in coal generation additions between 2018 to 2023. A lot of that in the central plants. A lot of changes have happened in India over the last 20 years. When we look at decarbonization strategies in the United States and decarbonization strategies in Europe, is very different than decarbonization strategies in India. So most of India's strategy for decarbonization or reducing their carbon intensity has been to shut down the older subcritical thermal generating plants and go to more supercritical, go to more ultra supercritical, and then most likely we'll see one of our first, 760C plants built in India or China in the future. So it's been really, the focus has been to optimize, decarbonization by improving the efficiency of these plants. And what we've seen over the last 20 years is that heat rate is very important. The efficiency of these thermal plants, how we operate these thermal plants. Typically, if we want to put in the three different buckets, the opportunities for air pollution control, it's something, relating back to optimizing boiler efficiency, optimizing turbine efficiency, and reducing the aux power of these plants. Because what we've seen historically is if these units aren't operating at their design efficiencies as they're built, then they can have the magnitude of 25% increase in their actual emissions. And that might be all emissions, NOx, SOx, CO2 footprint. So anytime we can gain a 1% thermal efficiency improvement, this typically results in somewhere in the magnitude of 2 to 3% less overall CO2 emissions emitted. So we look at 2019, India commissioned their first ultra supercritical plant, a 1320 megawatt plant at Khargone Station, 603 degree C plant, 270 bar. A lot of environmental controls. You can see this unit had wet flue gas desulfurization. It's got hydrogen lime for mercury control. It's got a ZLD system for managing water treatment, which is a significant issue in many parts of India where water constraints exist. And then when I look back to 20 years ago when I made my first trip to India and driving down the highways, looking at the emissions, looking at where India has gone over the last 15, 20 years, there's been some significant improvements in air quality and air emissions. And so we can look here kind of what India has done with their environmental norms as comparing units that were built after 2003 in the far left column. 2016, we saw a pretty significant, tightening up of the particulate matter and the SO2 and the NOx emissions requirements. And now anything built after 2017 or 2017, we can see that those environmental regulations continue to tighten up in India. So a lot of changes in environmental norms, how you're managing those norms, but probably the biggest change that I've seen in India over the past 5 years has been from really politically driven. Prime Minister Modi has made some pretty significant commitments for India. And what I'm representing here on this slide is some of those commitments: 500 gigawatts of non-fossil energy capacity by 2030, 50% renewable energy by 2030, 45% economy-wide carbon intensity reduction by 2030. Notice I didn't say total decarbonization, because India's carbon footprint is actually increasing, and it will continue to increase because of the demand for that power generation in the next 10 years. But their economy-wide emissions are going down on a, because they continue to, integrate more advanced supercritical units. They're also integrating more renewable energy. And so pretty substantial change when you look at that portfolio change. So this is where we were on the pie graph to the left, was June 30th, 2022. So the whole country had approximately 404 gigawatts of total power generation, most of that being represented by coal-based generation, which is in black. We see some wind. India has very little gas. India has some hydro, but not a large concentration. And then if we look over to the pie graph to the right-hand side, you can see that the ambitions of India are great, that there's ambitions to double their total generation capacity to 817 gigawatts. But to be able to get that 50% non-fossil power generation goal, that means a lot of solar, a lot of wind generation that operates at a much lower capacity factor is going to be operated. So they've got to have a much larger generation portfolio to be able to meet the current demands, which is just over 200 gigawatts of power generation by 2030. The forecasted expectation for coal-based thermal plants is going to be something closer to 250 gigawatts of generation. But to be able to meet those targets that have been committed to by the country, this is what the expectations are. Again, pretty ambitious. I don't know if India will actually achieve that 817 gigawatts of power generation, with 50% from renewables, but they're certainly strongly heading towards that path forward. So if we look at India's energy growth over the next decade, these are just some different scenarios. Say if we have delayed nuclear, if we have delayed hydro, if we have conservative estimates or increased demands that are, people buy more refrigerators, if they do more EV integration, or demands go up, there's forecasted to be somewhere between 240 to 260 gigawatts from coal-based generation to be able to meet those demands with balance in the grid. And what's different with India is if we look at North America, if we look at Europe, and we see how we're balancing the grid, we're doing it with thermal generation, but most of that is coming from fast start gas turbine engines or combined cycle gas units that have a much greater overall thermal efficiency of those plants, whereas India is really balancing the grid with the coal-based thermal generation because they have such a small portfolio of gas. They don't have the same infrastructure from gas and hydro as we see in other parts of the world. So this is some of the forecasts for VRE integration. Remember I said where we were in 2022 was somewhere between 10–11% total VRE generation. By 2026, 2027, India is looking at somewhere between 20 and 30% total generation. We really see that duck curve starting to form over the next few years in India. And then when we look at the demands on those thermal plants, what's that doing to the thermal-based generation? We could just look back in the rearview mirror at the last 10 years. If we look at 2010 to 2021, 22, we can see that thermal-based coal generation went from somewhere closer to 90% capacity factors all the way down to something closer to 70% capacity factors on average. And then if we look at, what that trend looks like in the future as we go forward and we looked at that 2026, 2027 duck curve and we bring that average back, that means that just in the next 5 years, India is likely to go from 60–70% capacity factors, something closer to 40% capacity factors, which means the demands for automatic generation control, the demands for two shifting, the demands for cycling on and off of this power generation, mainly from coal to balance the grid, is going to come from coal-based generation. And so then if we look at the duck curve, or as our CEO at EPRI would say, is becoming more like a canyon, the duck is getting fat, or is becoming more like a canyon. And Mike's going to share some global perspectives on kind of what the industry has done. But if we look at the forecast for 2031, 2032, and we look at all that wind and solar that's coming into the grid in India over the next decade, we essentially have to make up approximately 250 gigawatts of generation. If the wind stops blowing, the sun sets at the end of the day, that could be the magnitude of 250 gigawatts of generation that we have to bring. That thermal-based generation has to be able to meet those demands up and down on load. Anybody that's ever worked in thermal efficiency or been a BTU chaser like me for the last 25 plus years, managing thermal efficiency on these plants across the load range is somewhat difficult. And as we go to lower and lower capacity factors, managing that deviation for the design baseload generation, which most of the Indian coal plants were designed for baseload operation, as we come back to something less than 50% of their maximum continuous rating, you can see that has a pretty significant impact on thermal efficiency. And when we have a degradation in thermal efficiency, one thing the Central Electricity Authority and the regulators in India have done is they've imposed a tariff, which they call the ECR, Energy Charge Rate, for operating in an inefficient manner. And essentially, the discussions between CEA and the Ministry of Power last year was that anybody that was operating a plant over 2,500 kilocalories per kilowatt hour was basically going to have to shut down or close the plant in the future. After some of those forecasts came out in January of this year from CEA, the Ministry of Power and CEA came back and said, you know what, we changed our mind. Don't shut down any plants until after 2030 in India, because we're going to need everything to be able to meet those future demands. And some of the stories that we've seen around the world, what's happened recently in Texas, what's happened in Tennessee, the Carolinas, and other parts of the world, is really, opened the eyes and opened the perspectives, which Mike can talk a little bit more about. But one thing that is unique in India is that ECR, matters. And that tariff depends on how efficient those thermal plants are. As you go to these different modes of operation, whether it's load following, reducing your minimum load, two shifting, we've got to be able to optimize across the fleet. So that means meeting those faster ramp rates, meeting those reduced minimum loads, expanding the load range, bring those units on quicker so that when the sun goes down, we can achieve those, demands without having a rolling blackout happen, and do that on not only the net load peak days, but also the net load minimum days. And so this graphic just kind of represents those thermal plants going through these different modes of operations. But the reality of it is as we add more solar, we add more wind generation, you're going to, run into more scenarios where we're looking at these bottom two rows, daily cycling, extended, shutdown. So Rudy saw me posting a lot of presentations on LinkedIn about, building our capacity base and trying to get these thermal plants ready for flexible operations in the near future. And that's really what inspired this webcast was, what is India doing for their energy transition? How are they balancing that system frequency, managing the supply and the demand across the load range, with their story being very different? And so earlier I mentioned that most of North America and Australia, most places in Europe, they're doing it with 1x1, 2-on-1, or 3-on-1 combined cycle plants, or simple cycle gas turbine engines that can start up and shut down within 1 to 4 hours. India, again, what makes their story very unique is they're integrating a lot of renewable energy, but they're doing all the flexibility with the coal-based generation. So that means that India is going to have to do their balancing by two-shifting those plants, more cycling of the plants. And, obviously they've got some hydro, some gas, but very little as compared to other parts in the world. So that brings up reliability considerations and reliability concerns for India. As we've studied over the last 30 years at EPRI, we've got a pretty significant database of information through NERC's GADS data. So 2021, we did a study. We looked back at historical data. What can we learn from the past? And what we identified is that we see a significant uptick in reliability degradation when you drop the minimum load on a thermal-based generation asset, and certainly when you two-shift that thermal-based asset. Now, one concern I have for India is that you can see that orange bar to the far right is with two-shifting. So India's built a lot of supercritical once-through thermal generating assets over the last decade and a half. Since 2009 was the first one came on. Since then, we've seen more than 50 gigawatts of total supercritical generation come on. And so what I keep hearing is that the future is shut down subcritical units, continue to build supercritical and advanced supercritical coal plants in India to balance the grid. But what we've learned historically from the past is these supercritical units really don't like two-shifting. And the expectations for two-shifting are going to be significant in the future for India. So, a lot of that revolves around how you're managing water chemistry. When we do have degradation in reliability from fuel quality or pushing out outages to longer cycles, you can run into these issues with boiler temperature excursions. Those can turn into thermal excursions or mismatching on the turbine cycle. You can have other issues in the balance of plant that degrade the overall turbine cycle heat rate performance, and then that elevates the firing rates, and then that puts you in an uncompetitive state from an energy storage rate. So managing the reliability is important with India. Now, another thing that's unique about the Indian story is most of the domestic coals that are fired in these Indian-based thermal plants are somewhere between 40% to 60% ash content. So as we continue to modulate the loads down to lower loads, cycle them more, what we're seeing in India is a lot of challenges with flame stability. A lot of these large boiler houses that were designed for higher gas velocities that are having issues with ash deposition as they drop low loads. When they do have mills trip, that can result in a boiler trip because of process control optimization issues. And then when you run into situations to where you have these modulations in load that might be related back to the process or the chemistry control or flame stability issues, these can result into saturation events where you can have slugs of water going into a superheat or a reheat header, and then that can result in reliability issues, not only causing mismatch issues at the turbine, but also, potential damage to boiler components as well. So a lot of challenges, exist in the future with India. So what we're doing at EPRI to support the Indian industry is to, share lessons learned. We're going to need to do those increased startups, operate in AGC, spend more time in economic shutdown. But what we've seen is that as we operate with lower and lower capacity factors, the fixed cost of generation goes up for these units. So as we cycle them more, we see more potential opportunities for damage mechanisms to come into place. So, but the reality of it is that these plants are operating with financial constraints because the power generation and the capacity factors are much lower than what they were in the past, and they're going to continue to go down. So India has to develop this work smarter, not harder mentality to where we enhance the management systems, we enhance the knowledge transfer, we enhance the protection and defense systems that might be procedure improvements, they might be process optimization improvements, but there's a lot of changes that come along with the energy transition as we go across these different modes of operation. But performance always plays a key role in optimization, and performance has a huge impact on the reliability of these units as we go through these different modes of operation to ensure that we have reliability of things like pressure parts and components. So when we look at the different subsystems on a typical supercritical system, we have to optimize the inputs. We need to make sure that we have stable and consistent fuel quality so that we can manage flame stability, we can manage the combustion process, we can manage the heat rate across the load range of these units. And then as we cycle them more, we've seen a lot of issues with a lot of these plants not having furnace exit gas temperature control, or we see more accelerated erosion because of cycling of these units and pushing off maintenance outages that can result in the challenges with stoichiometry and O2 control that it negatively influences things like gas velocity or air gas control on these systems that influences not only the combustion and the boiler performance and the overall heat rate, but also the environmental performance of these units. So it really creates this complexity to where operations, requires you to go through these different subsystems of their thermal plants, make sure that we've got in the key performance indicators that we're managing, make sure that we've got the protection systems to be able to mitigate potential damage for these different systems. And then we got to take into account the cost for these different systems. And like I mentioned earlier, it's important to align risk with cycling. A lot of these units that have been built in India over the past 30 years were designed for baseload operation, not designed for cycling. So we've seen some pretty unfavorable degradation curves based on more startups and shutdowns. So as we go to more and more startups and shutdowns, that means that we're going to go from baseload operation to seeing more hot starts, more warm starts, more cold starts, or maybe staying offline for weeks or months at a time. And what that converts to is cost. And so as we go across that spectrum of operation and we look at the variation of cold, warm, hot startups, what we've seen is that these can cost from the magnitude of anywhere from $100,000 to $400,000 per startup, whether that be a cold, warm, hot startup. So we need to align a strategy on how we manage those costs and how we can mitigate damage, how to operate with those different load scenarios, and then also understand that different cycles, whether it be that warm, cold, or hot startup, are going to result in different damage rates for those different scenarios. And so what I'm showing in the table to the right is just relative damage for different coefficients for those mild load follows, significant load follows, HS is hot start, warm start, cold start. And in this case scenario, you can see that most of the damage is being done from significant load follows, even though the overall cost might be less for a load follow as compared to a cold or a warm start. But if you're doing 170 different significant load follows, that cost adds up over time. So it's costly to operate in flexible operations manner. And so there's been a lot of studies done in the last couple of years on O&M cost impacts for a typical subcritical unit, a typical supercritical units. And I think one of the eye-opening scenarios is that the cost for a subcritical typical 210 megawatt unit is much lower, in the magnitude of 50 to 100 Indian rupee lakhs per event versus a supercritical unit, which might be anywhere from 120 to 262. And to put that in perspective, 262 is over $400,000 US per startup. And so not only, is there a reliability function and cost for these different startup and shutdown scenarios, but also oil consumption for those starts and operating with flame stability at low loads is a big deal for India because fuel oil costs are extremely high. Even though they're not in too far proximity from the Middle East, their oil costs are very, very, very high, and they have a big influence on that energy charge rate and the heat rate impact that I mentioned earlier. So all that needs to be considered in their flexibility program. So managing that flexibility over the past couple of years, EPRI's been very involved with holding these capacity building workshops. We built some tools for doing vulnerability assessments to try to understand how the Indian industry is managing that flexibility across the load range. We've been working with Indian thermal plants on the systematic approach to flexibility, understanding the importance of understanding their market missions, especially when India just in the last 2 years went to a real-time balancing market to 2030. If we fast forward and we look at, India's ambitious plan is to have more than 50% of the energy coming from renewable energy in less than 8 years from now. And then so, setting goals, understanding the roadblocks, establishing failure mitigation plans, integrating data analytics, diagnostics, dashboards, and just working towards that fleet optimization strategy is critically important for India. So we've been doing a lot of work with industry on trying to align people, process, technologies when you look at these different parts of the thermal plants and really trying to understand what their risks are, how they're going to achieve reliable, safe, affordable, environmentally friendly power generation in the future. How do we tie that into the risk mitigation strategies, and then using things like complex data and complex vulnerability assessments to really identify where their gaps are, where the roadblocks are in the future, understand how to assess those different thermal plants, understand what their risk is, and trying to create this fingerprint of issues so that we identify what is yellow, what is red, what is vulnerable, what is at high risk, what needs to be improved upon. So there's a lot of work being done on, on improving operations, improving flexibility, improving the digital technologies, a lot of integration of advanced process controls and turbine water and protection systems, to be able to mitigate catastrophic failures on those major components and really, align that fleet optimization strategy, not only for when these thermal plants are online, but also offline. And very, very much like the U.S., we've also seen in India, when a lot of those thermal plants came on 25 years ago, those are great jobs and people never left. So there's also an aging workforce component in India to where we've got a lot of opportunities for knowledge transfer improvements, but also a lot of opportunities for India to learn what we've done in other parts of the world because, operating outside baseload operations is very new to India. So that was pretty rapid fire overview. Mike didn't believe me that I was going to get through 55 slides in the first 30, 40 minutes. But at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Mike to kind of share some perspectives on what's going on with the energy transition in more of a global standpoint. Mike?
Great. Thank you very much, Stephen. So I remember when I was still in college, we would always ask the professor if all of this was on the final. I understand from Rudy, everything that Stephen just shared will be on the final. So hopefully you absorbed every bit of that content. So Stephen went deep, right? There's a lot of challenges and a lot of nuances as we transition our electricity fleet. And as we bring in these new resources, they introduce new opportunities, but new challenges, right? So a lot of our newer resources are zero carbon, which is fantastic, right? It's addressing a worldwide issue that we've been building to ever since the Industrial Revolution. But they're fundamentally different assets than what we've used in the past, right? So in the past, Our thermal generation or our generation has been things where we can add more fuel or maybe allow more water to fall down through a hydro turbine to get more power. What we're increasingly building, though, are assets like wind turbines and solar plants where we can make use of a lot of energy, but we can't force that energy to be there when we need. And that's a bit of what we're going to be talking to here, because while the transition is continuing, we are decarbonizing, we are seeing challenges throughout the world, right? So a big one, a big elephant in the room was Europe with the cost of fuel after the Ukraine invasion. So they relied heavily on gas supply from Russia, and that became something that they could not make use of after the invasion. So then they started buying gas in the form of liquefied natural gas on world markets. That was a big issue for the former purchasers of that, right? So a lot of Asia relied on LNG supply, but that got sucked up by Europe to deal with their issue. Europe, as a first world region, has lots of resources. If you look at Pakistan, or you look at Sri Lanka, you look at Bangladesh, you look at India, you even look at China, they don't necessarily have the same amount of dollar resources per capita as the Europeans. So that led to gas getting to Europe, and Europe got through the winter, no problem, in part because they brought in a lot of natural gas, liquefied natural gas, but also it was a warm winter. But there was knock-on effects. There was load shedding in China because they were basically had low periods in hydro, as well as not an appetite to compete with the Europeans for LNG prices. India, somewhat less so, but they also saw coal prices go up, so they had some load shedding. The two big ones were really Bangladesh and Pakistan. They had frequent, basically, load shedding to try to balance the grid, but they ended up both having significant blackouts. So 100 million people were blacked out in Bangladesh, and in Pakistan, they had a blackout of 200 million people. Us in the West, we're not immune to this. We've had some pretty significant reliability issues as well. And it all just goes to show you that we're transitioning, but there's challenges here. And I'm going to walk through a little bit of those with a little bit more detail as we go. When we talk about energy security, like around the world, it used to be pretty much oil, right? A lot of our security was around oil security. And really, you can ensure your oil security by having a whole bunch of inventory. If I have enough inventory of oil for my country, then I can deal with different shocks in terms of price, in terms of supply, et cetera. 90-day tends to be the rule of thumb that is used. That's a secure supply that's managed different than some of our other energy supplies. Talk about natural gas security, we don't have that much storage for that, right? That's usually pipelines coming in, terminals coming in. That's why when that Nord Stream 2 pipeline was blown up after the Ukraine invasion started, that was a big deal. That's like a point source that brought a lot of gas into Europe that will not be fixed again. So it becomes more of a nodal analysis when we're talking about security. When it comes to the electricity supply, it can all go wrong a lot faster than that. It's minutes or seconds if you have a big enough frequency deviation. Really, we're balancing supply and demand every second, either at 60 hertz, 60 times a second, 60 hertz, or 50 hertz. So here in the US, it's 60 hertz, Europe, it's 50 hertz. But if that goes out and we start to have power outages, now we have, I like to say, or a lot of people like to say that electricity represents the first 5% of our GDP. Because without electricity, other things can start to fail. We saw during Texas, during the Winter Storm Uri, that when they were load shedding to try and balance things to prevent a blackout, they actually took out electricity supply to gas compressors that then starved gas-fired power plants that compounded the problem. Another issue for the Europeans, not so much for us, is that the cellular towers in Europe tend to all be battery backup for about 30 minutes. So if you go longer than 30 minutes for an outage, the cellular communications will start to knock down. And you can see how things could potentially unwind if we don't have that reliable electricity supply. So let's walk around the world and talk a little bit about this. In the US, we had one of the most significant events, I think, in my entire career with terms of electricity supply in Texas of February of 2021. What made this near blackout notable is it was a wintertime blackout in a region that's not winter resilient. If you've been to Texas, you know that they don't build the homes with a lot of insulation. It's not set up like where I'm from up in Ontario, Canada, where the homes are well insulated and they're set up for power outages during the winter. You're not going to have water pipes freezing or anything like that. On the evening of February 14th, 15th, in the middle of the night, Texas was starting to be unable to keep up with its power demand. So around 1 a.m., their frequency, and Texas is a different grid than the rest of the U.S., so there's an Eastern connect, a Western connect, and then Texas is all by itself. So it's got to balance its frequency by itself. That evening of, or that morning of February 15th, frequency started dipping. What does that mean? That means there's not enough electricity supply to meet the demand. A lot of people have maybe space heaters or other electric heating for their house, not well insulated. As it gets colder, they just get more and more demand. And we started to see this deviation. That deviation is important for an electricity network. Everything's synchronized to whatever that grid is. So in Texas, it's a 60 hertz grid for ERCOT, which is their regional system. And if that frequency drops to certain levels, load supplies or generators need to disconnect or risk destroying them. And we hit that point in Texas. So we drop below 59.4 hertz. At that point, a clock starts ticking. If we spend 9 minutes below that point, every steam turbine in the state of Texas that is part of the ERCOT grid is designed to protect itself by disconnecting. So we spent 5 minutes below that. If we had spent another 4 minutes, instead of what happened, we would have had a blackout across all of Texas during a winter storm when it's freezing, and it probably would have been at least 1 week for restoration. It could have been 2 or 3 or 4 weeks. That's a big thing, because what did happen, just in the form of load shedding, resulted in $300 billion worth of cost and over 200 deaths. This was the best case scenario of what happened. It could have been much, much worse. This is the first time we've gotten this close to something that bad happening. This is not the first time it's gotten cold in Texas. So you can see in 2011 in the bottom left, we had a similar cold snap, but we didn't have anywhere near the amount of load shedding. So we shed 20 gigawatts for 70 hours in 2021. And in 2011, the system shed 4 gigawatts for 7 hours. So it was a bad event, but nowhere near the scale of what recently happened. If we look at the transition in the top right, you can see how we're transitioning fuels in Texas. So we still had the same amount of nuclear generation in 2011 as we did for this winter storm. We built a lot of solar. We had shut down some coal. We built a lot of wind. We built a little bit of gas. What happened in Texas was principally a gas failure. We relied on the gas supply and it didn't show up. But there's some more nuance there, right? We haven't really built any gas in the last 10 years. So these are aging assets that we are relying on. And also, we need to understand how the new assets that we're bringing in that are low carbon, whether they contributed to help us out during these periods. And the worst load shedding hour in this event was 7 p.m. on February 15th. That was after the sun had set. So there was no solar generation, even though we had 6 gigawatts built. And the winds were gone. So the wind does not always blow in Texas. And although there was 31 gigawatts installed, we only got 600 megawatts of output there. That's a challenge with this non-dispatchable generation. It means we need to have our other generation still present, might not use it as much, but it needs to be there for days like this, or else we have some significant events. Now, we had another winter storm just recently, Winter Storm Elliott. Texas didn't become a big problem here. The big thing there is Texas may not have really fully addressed all its resiliency issues. It just didn't get as cold in Texas during Winter Storm Elliott as it did back for Winter Storm Uri. We did have rolling outages for the first time now in Tennessee, in North Carolina, as well as in Kentucky, although I don't have it on the slide. They were more like in the order of what we saw in Texas back in 2011, not what we saw more recently in 2021. This is an embedded risk factor that we need to continue to manage as we go through the energy transition. If we actually look at the whole month, this is like the lower 48. So all the generation in the lower 48 states, assuming it was all just one single grid. For the month of December of 2022, when Elliott occurred, and for the month of February of 2021 for when Uri occurred. What I got down in the bottom here is our different resources, right? So most of our generation is wind, solar, hydro, natural gas, coal, or nuclear. What you can see here is that disconnect between, all right, wind and solar can provide a lot of energy, but not necessarily when we have that peak demand. So you can see the peak for Elliott, it's around Christmas Eve, that's the highest demand period. In the table below, you can see that at that hour, that's when we got the most amount of energy we did for all of December from our natural gas assets, from our coal assets, from our hydro assets, and from our nuclear assets. Basically, they gave the best that they could during those hours to try to load. That highest demand hour was towards sunset or when the sun was set. So even though we have a lot of solar generation in the system, it was only putting out 2% of its best period during that. That fact that we need power at night is a significant thing that we need to think about as we bring on more and more solar resources to be able to deliver that. You can see it was reasonably windy. We got about 50% of its best hour for that month during the Elliott. The same can be true for Uri. You can see solar was actually coincided with some of the peaks there. But you can see that most of the demand or the best hours for natural gas and hydro and coal and nuclear across the low 48 basically coincide with those peaks. We need to have dispatchable generation to make these hours work. And if we don't, we're running some real risk in the transition. And if we look, like we saw in Texas, we're not continuing to build these assets, and that can potentially be a problem, and it showed itself in the Texas case. We look at, so that's a winter case. We get the same sort of issue in the summer. So in California now, we have risk of power outages in the late summer. We've built a lot of solar in California, and it's great when the sun is up. But in the late summer, the evenings stay hot, but the sun sets earlier and earlier and earlier. The first time this really resulted in issues was August 14th of 2020. They had rolling outages as the sun set. As a response to that, they've spent several billions of dollars trying to put in temporary gas generation to try to address it. Another thing that occurs in California is they have an enormous fleet of backup generators, much greater than the rest of any other state typically would have. And they're continuing to battle this. So in 2022, they had similar issues in early September. It was a hot period. They had about a week's worth of what they call EEA3s, or Energy Emergency Alert 3. They didn't actually load shed, but this is the alert level they have to be at to then load shed, to basically cut power to suppliers or to people who are using that electricity to try to balance things. And it's that Sunday evening, or that not Sunday evening, that sunset as the evening comes in the late summer where it's a real challenge. If we zoom out a little bit, so NERC's responsibility for doing reliability assessments for North America. You can see they do it ahead of the summer, they do it ahead of the winter, and they do a long-term one. And you can see that really in the West, we have risk identified for most of the Western regions in terms of reliability. Just recall, really the only one that went into that EEA3 but didn't have rolling outages was California last summer. Remains to be seen what we see. The summer reliability assessment for NERC is not out for this summer coming up. On the right there, you see that a number of the Southeast regions were identified as at risk for EEA3 or for reliability issues. They actually occurred in Carolinas, in Tennessee, and as well as in Kentucky. We had rolling outages in all three of those states for the first time ever. And then you can see the long-term reliability risk. Another thing that's happening that's never happened before is use of what the DOE calls the Federal Power Act Emergency Authority. So, and this has been used in the past, but it's being used in a different way nowadays, and it sort of highlights the fact that on marginal days, our system is stretched to the limit. So you can see that this is the use, just counts of how often it was used. So it was used in 2000, I think it's part of when Enron had those issues. It was used in 2003 for the Northeast blackout, which was a summer blackout, which has a little bit less risk than a winter blackout. But you can see now in 2020, 2021, 2022, they're using it for very particular reasons. In California, they use it for what they call max generation orders in the summer. When they go into EEA3, they give out a max generation order, and you can see the language there. But it basically says, you know what? Yeah, we know we have permits on this for basically emission control and to protect the environment, but all those we have to put them aside because we need max generation or we have a risk that the system will collapse, which is not a good spot to be in, right? So we want is safe, reliable, affordable, environmentally responsible electricity. But when we're asking for one of these max generation orders where we ignore permits so that we can continue to have reliability, we're not capturing everything we're really looking to do for an electricity system. In Texas, they use these for winter. PJM used it for the first time ever in the winter during Winter Storm Elliott, asking for that same permission. So the system's under some stress. We now zoom out, talk about Europe. The big story in Europe was the price of gas and what was feared to be winter blackouts associated with insufficient gas. So you can see here the price trend. You can see a number of world events impacting on that. The prices did get significantly increased significantly. I think there was big economic impacts within Europe. So there's been some what they call deindustrialization. So some big chemical companies and other companies shut down operation and looked to move out of Europe because their energy costs are too high. But largely, even though we had a lot of these headlines about concern during the winter, it didn't come to be. We had a warm winter, and then they also had built up all the gas storage inventory in Europe to basically 100% type levels. And so Europe has gotten through this, but as I mentioned before, there were some knock-on effects to the regions that relied on that LNG that Europe basically took because they could offer a higher price. So let's just continue on. So I talked about in the US sense, all right, renewable, solar and wind can provide a lot of energy, but it can't necessarily provide it when we those peak hours, right? Because we can't force the sun to be shining or the wind to be blowing when demand is at its highest. You can see this in the evolution of the German electricity grid. So Germany's quite famous for their renewable penetration and their development of penetration. So on the left there, you can see basically the line charts are for the capacity and the area chart is for the generation. And basically the black line in gray is basically the former generation, the green line and the green is the wind and the solar. So they've built an enormous amount of wind and solar over the last 20 years. They haven't actually reduced how much more dispatchable generation they needed. And their total energy use, which would be the add up of the area, so basically about 500 terawatt hours per year, that hasn't changed. They've just built a lot of capacity, a lot of new renewable capacity. It's providing energy, but it hasn't diminished that need for that other existing capacity. It's important. That does result in decarbonization, but it's important to continue reliability to realize that you might not be actually replacing all your dispatchable generation as you build, even though you can see some pretty significant numbers. There's more wind and solar installed in Germany than the combine of everything else, but the combine of everything else provides more energy. If you look to the right, what we have stacked up here is every 15 minutes. Remember, every minute counts in an electricity system. I got to have it balanced every minute. Otherwise, I get that frequency deviation, and it could be like Texas, where I almost black out the entire region. And you can look at peak demand versus peak net demand. And peak net demand is basically how much demand there was in the region, less what solar and wind was able to provide. When we look at that, we see that the peak net demand reduced that peak period by 14 or 13%. But wind and solar provided over 30% of the energy in the year. What does that mean? That's factoring in what Stephen was explaining, right? You see capacity factors going down and things like that, and that's good. We're getting more energy that has zero carbon, but we haven't diminished our need to have this backup capacity on these critical hours like we saw unfold in the case of Texas. So it's really important as we go through this transition to understand that we need to have backup power, because we cannot force the wind and solar to be on every hour that we need. And until we have storage at a much greater capacity than we currently do, we need to figure out how to keep the system reliable with some of the existing assets we have. So if we zoom out again and we just look at the European Union, on the left there, the green is nuclear generation capacity, the black is fossil, the red is renewables. Again, you can see that same trend. So the blue line is the actual amount of generation required in Europe. You can see it leveled off about 20 years ago. We still need basically the same amount of thermal or fossil and nuclear as we did. We've built a huge amount of renewables, but we still need, or they still maintain that fossil and nuclear, even though it's producing a little bit less energy. And you can see that on the right. You can see the red and the yellow is the solar and the wind. And you can see they're increasingly providing more energy. We're seeing less energy from the other assets, but we still need that capacity for the marginal day. So Europe and the US, we're not where generation is growing, right? This is a global problem in terms of CO2 emissions. So we really need to look, as Stephen was showing, India and China and Asia. So let's do that. If we look at China, they're building everything. So they're building coal, they're building hydro, they're building wind, they're building solar, and you can see their energy mix continuing to grow. As I mentioned before, they do have load shedding events. They do basically have instances where they want to basically curb demand. So they're still straining to keep up with that demand growth. And that it takes the form of maybe periodic outages, especially some regions are very dependent on hydropower. So if there's a drought, that can be a significant issue. And then the prices of not just gas, but coal also went up during the crisis caused by the Ukraine invasion. So that also caused them to curb their appetite. We zoom out again, you can see the same sort of trend. You can see that they're building a lot of fossil generation, a little bit of nuclear, a lot of renewable. But if you look at the actual generation, coal and hydro is most of the generation. Wind and solar continue to go up, but there's that whole difference in, you can build a lot of capacity for wind and solar, but you can't necessarily get the same amount of generation as you could for a nuclear asset or a hydro asset that's basically got access to significant water. So this generation build out of coal continues. I think everybody has heard that China is back to a record pace for not only installing renewables, but for installing coal. And part of the reason is you need that firm behind there, more renewables that should cut their CO2 intensity, but they're going to continue to increase how much CO2 they're putting in the atmosphere for some time. And I believe that I think they are supposed to aim to peak around 2030, same as India. If we look at India, we see the same sort of trend. And you can see that, yes, a lot of renewable generation is now being built, but the bulk of the generation is still coming from coal assets. And we talked about some of the outages they've had. For the ones that don't have coal as a backbone, they were really sensitive to those price shocks that resulted when Europe had to start buying LNG on the open market and other fuels to make up for the shortfall caused by not accepting Russian gas. Sri Lanka is in very bad situation economically because of their fuel costs, in part because of their fuel costs, but the economy is in a very bad spot in Sri Lanka. To mention Bangladesh, they were trying to manage this with basically load shedding, but they did have a blackout on October 4th, and that was the 100 million person. I didn't update these slides, but subsequent to the 200 million person blackout for Pakistan, they're now looking to develop more coal plants than they were in the past. Is that good? for Pakistan, maybe in terms of energy supply, but if we're all trying to reduce carbon emissions, that's a challenge, which sort of shows that, all right, different regions can have unintended consequences on others if we can't actually achieve that reliable electricity supply. So as we transition now, there's some other hidden risks here, especially for the West. And Stephen already touched on it. We're not building a lot of fossil generation anymore. What we have is an aging combined cycle fleet and an aging coal fleet. You can see here what we have is equivalent forced outage factor. That's the EFOF. So as those get higher, reliability of those plants go down. As the age of those plants increase, reliability of those plants go down. So we're cycling them more to respond to this changing energy mix, but they're also aging because we're not building new ones, right? So our plants that we rely on those marginal days, so in Texas, the morning of February 15th at 2 a.m., the plants are older than they were in 2011. They've operated a lot more flexibly, and they're not as reliable as they once were. That occurs for combined cycle plants, but we also see a similar trend for coal plants. So we've got this latent risk that really there's marginal days where we really rely on the entirety of our fossil assets and our nuclear assets to make the day work. But they're not as reliable as they used to be because of their aging, and we're operating them more flexibly. And if we get into that risk on those marginal days. So what do we really want you to take away from this? There's electricity supply reliability is at risk. There are some real challenges, especially here in the US, where we don't have the transmission network like the Europeans do. So the transmission network in Europe is much better. So it's harder for that frequency deviation to actually occur. We've got spots like Texas where we can have significant issues, and we're more regionalized in terms of our generation in the US. So we've got pretty significant risk for us. Typically, you see costs increase before you see these reliability issues. We've got latent risk both in Europe and in the US. We've got aging assets. The new assets we're building provide a lot of energy, zero carbon energy, but they don't necessarily provide it on demand. And so the aging assets are needed on the marginal day, and they might not deliver. So I already mentioned the new assets have limited dispatchability. So we need to start considering the incorporation of storage as we bring those in, if they're actually going to be able to help us on these marginal days. We've got these interdependency risks. The big elephant in the room, I think, is really that what we saw with winter failures and what occurred during Uri and what occurred during Elliott to a much lesser extent. And we do have the real possibility of system collapse. And a system collapse in the winter, if the region is not hardened for winter, is a real significant concern, and something that actually already almost happened just 2 years ago. So I hope that this was entertaining. I hope you got some useful information out of it. I would just want to thank Rudy for allowing us to present. Remind you that EPRI's here trying to shape the future of energy with you, and turn it back over to our host to see if there's any questions. Thank you very much, Rudy.
Wonderful. Great presentation, guys. Stephen and Michael, you presented a lot of information, very useful information. And I'd like this audience to respond. First, I want the students to ask questions. There's two ways you can do this. You can unmute yourself, introduce yourself, and ask Mike and Stephen the question that you have in mind. Or you can go to the chat box and enter the question. And between Susan and I, we will read those questions out. After a little while, I'll have the general audience participate in the Q&A session. So students, why don't you unmute yourself and introduce yourself and ask your question, please. Questions for Michael and Stephen.
Hi, Mr. Michael and Stephen. I'm one of the energy system engineer ESE master student. And I would like to ask, I'm sorry, Mr. Stephen, You just mentioned about in India, I mean, in this country, they didn't develop as much as like a wind energy due to the mentioned problem, because the weather pattern is different from other countries.
So in India, they have they hit their peaks in the summer. So, you know, in the summertime months, typically right before the rainy season starts in May and June is when they have the hottest months, April to June time period. And the wind is also the greatest. So they do see a large uptick in wind generation in that time. And, you know, and then from April to September is the rainy season. So you get a lot of rain. And so issues, you know, before the rainy season with hydro generation, water supply to the plants, increased condenser back pressure, challenges with increased auxiliary power consumption. So there is significant weather changes in India, but the reality of it is most of the renewable energy is providing a capacity factor of anywhere from 15 to 25% of that capacity factor for that generating asset. It's not going to be like a thermal asset that can be dispatchable and be able to meet those demands 24/7.
Okay, thank you. And I'm sorry, I have another question for Mr. Michael. Mr. Michael, sorry. You just mentioned about the energy generation in Europe, especially in Germany. So how do you think of what happened to Germany in 2012 and 2013? Because they especially for solar, I mean the renewable energy for solar, they had they met some break. I mean stopped for solar. So what do you think of that?
So what was the break? Sorry, there another. I got some audio things. What's the question around 2012 and 2013 in Germany, Victor?
I mean, what happened in Germany in 2013? They stopped for install more solar panel. I mean, solar energy more. In that particular.
Yeah. So yeah, I think along the way. So I think the energy wind really began in earnest in the early 2000s, and they've had fits and starts in different ways. So they did have periods where they slowed up on solar. They're continuing to build out solar. One of the challenges in Germany is they don't have a lot of solar irradiance, right? So even though they have a massive solar build out, their capacity factor compared to what we would see, say here in like in the desert part of the U.S., significantly lower. So in the case of Germany, really when you're talking about renewable build out, you get a lot more bang for your back with wind or offshore wind than you necessarily do with solar. They're continuing to build out solar now, though. They did have a retraction. I think that there was some of that pushback on in terms of cost and in terms of what we're getting out of this installation. The biggest story, I think, with Germany, though, over the last 20 years, it was the decision to shut down all their nuclear, right, which they finally completed in March of this year. Had they left that nuclear in play and built out all this renewable, they'd be a lot closer to that net zero goal that we're all aiming for. But obviously, there's a lot of things at play in terms of making a decision on a national basis. So they are committed, though, right now to increasing solar and wind and moving towards a potential future hydrogen economy, which right now means that they're going to build potentially a lot more gas-fired power plants.
Mike and Stephen, students, questions, please. Ask your question, unmute yourself and introduce yourself and ask your question, please. Students, questions?
Hi, I have a question. My name is Oshan. I'm a full-time ESE student and I'm from Sri Lanka. So thanks for your wonderful presentation. I have a small question. Can you explain a little bit more in a situation like the duck curve situation, or more of like a canyon curve, like you mentioned, with a fleet full of subcritical coal or nuclear plants, where the renewable penetration actually knocked out all the other generation to zero level, even sub-zero levels. So how typically the system operators tackle this kind of or respond to this kind of situation? So are they allowing all this renewable penetration and shutting down the thermal fleet, or are they running with a kind of a minimal loads with thermal generation, with kind of curtailing the solar or wind generations?
So sort of all the above. So let's talk about like what's occurring right now in California. So in California, and it goes to like the seasonality, right? In California, there's a lot of solar energy in the spring. There's even more in the summer, but there's not a lot of electricity demand in California in the spring because it's just lovely there, right? So you get a lot of solar. Where you see the biggest duck curve or canyon curve typically is on the weekend, where you don't need a lot of electricity. And the way they can manage it in California, or for CAISO, the California Independent System Operator, there's got a number of things going on. First, they can swing a lot of power out of state. So they do that. So as the sun rises, they're basically, so maybe on a spring day, they might need 25 gigawatts of total power. As the sun starts rising, they go from importing maybe 4 gigawatts of power to exporting 4 to 5 gigawatts. So that's like a 9 gigawatt swing to allow for more solar to get in. They ramp down their gas, so their gas may be up at maybe 8 gigawatts. They'll ramp it down to probably about 4 gigawatts. They'll have 4 gigawatts running typically. They'll also basically stop allowing as much water across the dams, right? So they'll start holding that water supply so that they can wait until the sun starts setting. They will also start, they've now got about 2 or 3 gigawatts of batteries, so lithium ion batteries. They'll start charging those. So they do all those things when the solar is really a lot available. They still will be curtailing maybe about 4 gigawatts as well. So they'll curtail about 4 gigawatts of solar. They'll export with a net swing of maybe 8 gigawatts. They'll ramp down gas by maybe 4 gigawatts. They may ramp down hydro. Like right now, they have a lot of hydro this year, so they might ramp it down by 3 gigawatts, and they're waiting for the sun to set. When the sun starts setting, the import swing is quick, so you can get away with a lot. The battery swing is quick. Then you can ramp the gas and ramp the hydro and make that system. To try to emulate that with a coal-fired unit, you'd be taking years and years off those coal-fired units. But that's how they do it. Nobody else is quite running quite the same duck curve or canyon curve as what California has. But that import-export is a huge thing for them right now to be able to achieve that.
So, Oshan, just one important comment Mike said is that thermal fleet has to drop down and load. And so what we've seen, another challenge is a lot of our members and utilities that are out there, they're limited on number of startups that they can have on their permit per year. So there's a lot of strategy behind that thermal fleet and how you're managing that thermal fleet and or those cycles. Remember that those cycles cost money. So a lot of the reliability implications, environmental implications, or potential permit challenges. So you got to build a strategy that's pretty robust behind how you manage that dispatchable fleet. But it all boils down to dispatchable generation to be able to meet those demands to balance that grid.
Thank you. Questions from students, please unmute yourself, introduce yourself and ask a question. And as I mentioned before, if you have a question and you're too shy to talk about it, enter it in the chat box and we will go through it. So I will advise everybody to, if you have a question, put it in the chat box if you'd like to get it out as early as possible. Student questions? Right, I'm going to now open it up to the general audience. Questions for Michael and Stephen.
Rudy, this is Hal Long. I have a question.
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, it was a great presentation, and I really understand better why India and China need to continue with coal. So that was great, because when you hear about it in the news, you always hear, you kind of assume that they're old plants, but they're really putting on new plants that have a little more capacity, or a little more flexibility. But my question is, going down the road, I see that the really big need around the world is storage, because if you have storage, you can handle this without the need to bring up thermal units. So how do you see that going forward? Storage would be obviously batteries, and maybe storing into water resources and so forth. But how do you see that going forward? The batteries seem to be the key thing here.
Yeah, so I mean, as of today, pump storage hydro is the clear winner, but you can't scale that like you can scale batteries right now, right? There's a lot of permitting restrictions in many places. So I don't think we've built any new pump storage here in the US in decades. There is some effort to increase that pump storage. I say that because that's like the biggest bulk storage that we have, and it's many hours available. So it's really the ideal storage that we would like to have as we build out. What's coming on is certainly the battery storage. What we see mostly, though, are 1 to 4 hours, which are really good battery storage for that California problem, where the sun's setting a little bit too early and I need another hour, 2 hour, 3 hour, or 4 hour of power. So those resources are coming on more significantly and sort of help with that. But on the converse, that winter period, those are typically 12-hour, 24-hour, 36-hour, 70-hour problems, which battery storage is really not well suited for helping us. What we've seen is have been battery storage in some of these ones, but they're 4 hours. That once that expels or is used, there's no opportunity to recharge it because they're still in that shortage situation. So what we've been doing at EPRI is we're trying to expedite some other longer duration storage technologies. So thermal energy storage, but it's not necessarily going to be a technology that's widespread in the next 5 years. We're hoping it becomes more commercial in the next 5 years. There's also quite available right now is compressed air energy storage, although it's geographically limited, but we're trying to expedite that. But really these longer duration storage will be key. And then the longest duration storage, which is converting that extra energy into a fuel. So the big news one is the hydrogen. If you can basically convert energy into hydrogen when it's in surplus, you can use it whenever you need to, but you need to build a whole economy there. Obviously, there's lots of work with the hydrogen hub money from the government that may initiate this, but we're talking if long duration energy storage, more solutions are 5 to 10 years away. Really that big hydrogen solution could be 10, 15 years away, but we need to be doing stuff in both cases today if we're gonna hit that. So storage is coming, but storage is not going to be able to solve the next 10 years, which some people call the messy middle, as we continue our journey towards net zero. Steven, you want to?
So my only comments on that, I got to be careful how I disagree with Mike because he's my boss. But my
you don't have to be careful.
But, Mike said that pump storage is the clear winner in regards to energy security. In my opinion, those oil reserves or that ultimate coal pile beside the coal-fired power plant is the clear winner when it comes to energy security, because that is your security, to know that we'll have fuel supply, that we can generate that, and that's going to provide that dispatchable generation when we have those challenging times that Mike presented. So I don't think Mike disagrees with that, but
I'm putting on my green future hat, and if I don't have coal, then I want pump storage.
Those are great answers, and I really like the idea of creating hydrogen as a backup energy. But another question, one more question: if they're continuing to put in thermal coal plants, obviously, it seems to me carbon capture becomes more important if we're really going to get to net zero. So you didn't talk about carbon capture at all, but that would seem if India or China really need to continue with the coal, don't they also need to do the carbon capture?
Yeah, so China's taken some positive steps towards this carbon capture. Now, they have an enormous coal fleet, right? So they have some bigger demonstration sites where they're doing carbon capture and storage, but most of the fleet is not carbon capture today. And carbon capture is another one of these technologies where we have some useful demonstrations, but it's not wide scale, and it's probably 5 to 10 years before it's really scaling in a significant way. And then the challenge with carbon capture, especially for existing assets, is you may be able to capture in a location, but it could be miles, thousands of miles away from a good storage site, which is a huge amount of infrastructure if you're actually going to store it, because you're going to have to build pipelines to send that there. There are some regions in the U.S. where we've got lots of spots for that, like in Texas and around Louisiana. It should be fairly easy to be able to do carbon capture and storage there. But there's a lot of other regions that are nowhere near that. So even if you can capture the CO2, you need to get it to the right spot to then store it. So there's a lot of infrastructure that should occur. But again, we need to be working on this stuff today if we're actually going to achieve solutions that are workable in the 2040 or 2050 timeframe. So great question, Hal.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hal. And questions for Mike and Stephen. Let me read one question off the chat box. I think the question is related to given the situation in Bangladesh, is there what's the best type of system? Energy.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of challenges in these regions. So what we've found is if you can interconnect with more neighbors, you can have more opportunities to be able to hedge your risks and things like that. Although this is, Bangladesh and that region, there's a lot of challenges associated with that. So right now, Bangladesh is reliant on a lot of gas, and so that's really a significant challenge. I don't know what the hydro resources look like in Bangladesh, and I don't know what relations are with Myanmar or with India. But power lines from neighboring countries are probably quick. Hydro resources are quick. The building out generation and maybe a little bit more difficult. I don't want to say it, but one option is coal. That is what Pakistan ended up choosing, and at least you get you have some variety there, whether you go from natural gas to coal to your oil-fired generation. So it's tough. You could also say nuclear, but I think that's a region where people are not keen on sharing nuclear technologies, and so it's tough. It's really, really, really tough.
So, this question brings up this thought here, Michael. Nuclear is the other green energy nobody talks much about, but you've pointed out that we're building renewables in a tremendous space all over the world, without really bringing up storage for obvious reasons. Why, is there a country that is kind of managing with nuclear and renewables?
So I would say by far and away, leadership country, so where do we actually achieve near net zero electricity? It's the countries that are either blessed with a lot of hydroelectric, or a country like France that has built a lot of nuclear. Those are the only types of countries that we've really got well down to near net zero. So France is continuing its commitment to nuclear. You can see that aside from Germany, a lot of the European countries now are increasing their nuclear. So Finland just started up a new nuclear reactor. Other regions are considering new nuclear build. Domestically here in the U.S., we're probably not going to build any more big reactors, but we have a lot of these small modular reactors that are now on the books and are progressing. The first one that may actually be built will actually be in my home province back in Ontario. So Ontario Power Generation and Tennessee Valley Authority have a joint agreement with GE Hitachi, and via the one nuclear plant, the Darlington nuclear plant in Ontario, they plan to have, hopefully, their first small modular reactor commercial by 2028 or 2029. If that starts happening, there's a lot of regions in the US that are going to follow suit if they're reasonably successful. So I think that there is an increasing appetite for nuclear in many regions, but I mean, it's a big technology, which has sort of made it a little bit challenging. If the small modular reactors can become successful, I think that makes it a little bit easier to then deploy and to accelerate. There's a lot to like about nuclear in terms of it's firm, it can be dispatchable, it is very low carbon. The critical mineral impact is much better than most renewable technologies or battery technologies. So they're basically, you don't need to go to the Congo to dig stuff up to be able to make a nuclear plant. So there's a lot of advantages to the nuclear if we can get there and reduce that cost and that risk.
Yeah, I must point out, Mike, that two of my students, they're working on a capstone project looking at the role of nuclear power and climate change. And there was some very interesting data where during one decade, when this is in case of China, they were building more renewables, but not building nuclear as much. And their net emissions was high. I mean, kept going high at that decade. In the next decade, when nuclear build was increasing, with renewables also increasing, their net emissions came down. So there's a great case study that these guys have put together.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up at fossil plants, but I mean, nuclear plants are the way to get to zero carbon. That's my firm belief.
Unless you're like New Zealand, where you have 80–90% of your power generation from geothermal or hydro, and I think it's important to understand the energy landscape and your geography and what's around you on what type of energy mix you incorporate. But I've got a friend, Tony, in New Zealand that brags about his 90% plus renewable energy all the time, but not everybody's blessed with 90% or 80–90% geothermal and hydro that's very, very dispatchable. And that's how they do it. And the one 400 megawatt coal plant is what balances the grid in New Zealand.
You should also tell your friend, we've got some cities with more people than all of New Zealand.
So there is one question in the chat box. In one sentence, what's the reason why India and China need to continue the use of coal for energy generation? His network was down when you said something. Please repeat that.
So essentially, China and India are still on that path of growth for amount of basically energy use, right? So the energy use per capita is still growing. So both of them need to be able to have essentially all cards on the table to be able to achieve that. Unfortunately, as we pointed out, renewable energy can provide a lot of energy, but it can't necessarily provide it every hour you need. So they need firming capacity. Coal they don't have a lot of gas availability. Both those regions have coal as a resource that's local. So I think both will continue to focus on coal, especially with the lesson we learned from Europe, right? Where they're reliant on Russian gas, then that went away, and then global prices of gas went up significantly. So you need to use what you have in your region as part of your reliable supply. That difference between reliability or dispatchability on demand is really important, and that trends to push you towards hydro. Build as much as you can, and China has certainly done that. I don't know if any of your students have heard, but there's a place called the Three Gorges Dam, which produces more electricity than all of New Zealand. So the hydro wherever you can, and then if you've got resources in your country, and you're growing and you're trying to raise a lot of people out of a depressed economic situation to global standards, you need energy and you need a reliable supply. So I think that's why they continue and will continue to build coal assets, hopefully with CCS, Definitely much more efficient. There's a lot of drivers, and Stephen presented that. But in the near term, I don't think you can get away with that unless China or India finds some significant natural gas supplies, in which case they may replan.
I think the elephant in the room in India is the fact that right now they're like 1,250 kilowatt per capita. And if you look at the US, they're somewhere closer to 12,000 per capita. And then if you look at where China is, and and as the people of India start buying more refrigerators and more electrical appliances, and I think there's a lot of uncertainty of what the per capita emissions will be in India when you look at, right now 600 million people without refrigeration in India, in their homes. And so there's a lot of uncertainty about what their future demands will actually be and how they'll manage that efficiency going forward.
Well, I think on that note, I'd like to end the seminar. It's a very sobering lesson, and you guys brought this out so beautifully, where if this transition does not succeed in some key countries, it can bring down this whole, the world. In fact, they may be less willing to make the jump into renewable energy. Again, thank you, audience, for your attention. Thank you, speakers, for your talk. And as I said, this is the last in our spring series. We will be coming back on the air in the fall. And, definitely we'll look forward to a very interesting fall session too. Mike and Stephen, thank you very much for your presentation. See you all.
Thank you very much.
Thanks
Appreciate it.
Take care.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Very interesting.
Thank you.
All right, Susan,
I'm here.
you want to stop recording?